Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010. Our book is The World of Philosophy, an introductory reader by Stephen Cahn. In this video, we're going over the concept of free will. And we'll be going over essays by Thomas Nagel, W.T. Stace, and one by Stephen Cahn himself. And this will be in relation to Exam 3. Part B, question 8, that's the last question. What are the differences between determinism, compatibilism, and Nishida's view on free will? So I'm going to do one more video on Nishida. In this one, I'll go over the three authors I mentioned previously, but it will help you answer this question. And for Part A, question 4, which of the views on free will do you think presents the best argument? Why? And explain. So you've got to choose one of the four questions for Part A, and these three, if you think one of them is the best, then you could write about that person. So free will. So to discuss the question of whether or not human beings act freely, if we have free will or not, you have to define what a human being is. Which we were doing in the previous videos. You know, are we the byproduct of material evolution, or are we eternal souls? Your two basic options there. Can consciousness be reduced to matter? Oh, if it can you define matter? That's a big problem, and that issue raises the entire history of physics from Isaac Newton through holographic string theory. So the quantum mechanics is discussed in a few of these articles about free will, because for one thing, quantum mechanics says that sometimes events at the subatomic level just happen spontaneously. Radioactive decay, you can't predict when a photon might leave an atom, or when an electron might skip from one orbit level to the other. It just kind of happens. You can predict probabilities for things to happen. Another thing is you can't know the position and the momentum of a quantum particle at the same time, which is an issue. So, you know, now that I've begun, let me just say the issue of determinism related to Isaac Newton's mechanistic cosmology. The point was that existence, the material world, consists of three-dimensional space, absolute space, up, down, left, right, backward, and forward. It's just completely empty. It's an empty framework within which things can occur. And there's time, a linear time that flows forward. Things endure through time at the same rate that moves forward constantly, regardless of how fast you're moving. And then little bits of matter, little ball bearings of unthinking matter extended in space. So the Laplace, actually, let me read a little. So here's my book, The Psyche and Singularity, where I argue that the self is the gravitational singularity. So let's see here. Laplace, oh, where are you? Here it is, over here on page, okay. So in 1814, Laplace again used Newton's mechanistic cosmology to support the same kind of determinism. Here's what he said. If a superhuman consciousness could know the position and the momentum of every particle at any point in time, that infinite intelligence could extrapolate to the infinite past and the infinite future and know where every single combination of atoms would be. So it would know the past and the future completely. So to summarize, Laplace, Pierre-Simon Laplace. And he said, for it, this infinite intelligence, nothing would be uncertain, and the future as the past would be present to its eyes. So that implies there's no free will, because everything is fixed. It's determined. The mechanistic laws of physics determine the position of every single atom backward and forward in time infinitely, and that means our bodies, exactly what our bodies will do, what we'll say, how we'll move. It's all predetermined. There's no free will in that worldview. And then Einstein in 1905, the first big break from Isaac Newton, he maintained the determinism of the Newtonian framework, because he said it's not that you can predict what the future will be and you can determine what the past was by extrapolating backward and forward from the positions of the particles now. Rather, the past and the future coexist with the present in a four-dimensional space-time continuum, a block universe. But the point is, it's determined. Everything you ever have done, everything you ever will do, is occurring simultaneously, which would imply that nothing can be changed. If nothing could be different, then it must be. Where's the room for free will there? Then quantum mechanics comes in, and the two-slit experiment says, well, is a particle a wave, or is it a particle? At that subatomic level, do things behave as waves, or do they behave as particles? The two-slit experiment, again, I really think they should have a chapter on this, considering many of these articles bring up quantum mechanics because it has so many philosophical implications. So does relativity theory, which they don't bring up, I think, because it says the past, present, and the future coexist, which challenges the evolutionary paradigm of the evolution of three-dimensional space through time, which is the standard assumption in academia, that how can there be an evolution of events if each event on the timeline coexists according to relativity theory? So that is the problem. But at any rate, let's see if this is a particle or a wave. We'll shoot electrons through a wall with two little slits that are parallel lines next to each other, and behind them will be a detector screen. If they're particles, they'll go through the two slits, line up like two lines directly behind, as if you'd shot little bullets. If they're waves, the wave will go through, it'll split up into two new little waves, they'll spread out and interfere with each other, making a ripple pattern. So they shot the electrons through the wall with the two slits. The electrons were detected as particle hits, but not directly behind the two slits. They were distributed all over the back detector screen, and after a certain amount of time, a pattern emerged, which was the same pattern that you would have seen had a wave gone through all at once. So then they said, well, let's look with an electron microscope which slit it's going through. When they did that, the electrons lined up directly behind the two slits, which implies when you observe them, they behave like little particles, well-behaved little bullets. And when you're not observing them, they move through space as waves of probability. So not liquid waves, but it's the same shape as liquid waves, but they're not physical things, or you might just, maybe there's some kind of subtle matter, but at any rate, they're waves of statistical probability for where a particle might collapse were it to be observed, most likely at the peak or at the valley. But it could appear anywhere within the wave, and the wave stretches out to infinity, so with a very minute probability it could appear, very, very at the farthest reaches of the universe. So that seemed to say, okay, you can't have that Laplacian determinism, because even a cosmic intelligence would not be able to know the position and the momentum of any single particle at the same time. If you know, the more you know about the position, the particle nature, the less you know about the momentum, the wave nature. They're mutually exclusive ways of looking at the same thing, mutually exclusive but complementary ways. So that is the issue with quantum mechanics. It seems to say things aren't determined, and in some respects things happen spontaneously. The decay of these atoms, which would imply, oh, there's an element of total indeterminacy in the universe, and they'll say that bears on the issue of free will as well. So if everything's determined, you don't have free will. The other option is that things are not determined. Things happen spontaneously with no reason. Well, in that case, again, you don't have free will, because you're not willing to do something. It's just happening. You're not responsible for things that just happen, nor are you responsible for things that must have happened and could not have happened any other way. So moral responsibility seems to disappear if free will disappears, and it's hard to see how can there be free will if everything that happens has a cause, and the chain of cause and effect goes back to the infinite past. When I say that David Hume would say, well, there is no causal link. There are no causal chains. Things happen. We insert these relations of ideas for his definition of the self. There is no self because the self would have to be some enduring, uninterrupted impression, a sense impression that stayed the same from one moment to the next. And furthermore, it would not be able to be compounded of parts. It would have to be a simple, point-like entity with all of its memories from the past, the present, and the future occurring simultaneously. That would be a self. And then even as I'm saying that, would that self have free will if the past, the present, and the future were fixed? Where's the issue of choosing to do something? So there's so many philosophical questions. As I said, to answer the question of free will, you have to have an answer for the other fundamental questions. There's 4 basic questions in the first book I started teaching at this school, 4 fundamental questions. Who or what am I? So what is the self? What can I know? That's epistemology. What is knowledge? How much can a human know? What is real? Is this just a mechanical universe? Are we in the dream of Vishnu? Is this the shadows in the cave of Plato? So that's another question. And then what should I do, or who should I be? Morals. So free will has to do with moral responsibility. How can you be held responsible for anything you do if everything is fixed and determined? All right, so it's an introductory class. Obviously, you don't have to master all the details of the 4 fundamental questions, but with that preview in place of the history of physics, and then string theory, which I just realized I didn't mention. It combines quantum mechanics and general relativity to say every quantum particle is made of these more fundamental tiny little strings that are very elastic. The bottom line for holographic string theory is the past, the present, and the future coexist out at the horizon of the cosmos, where space-time is expanding from our perspective at Earth away from us at the speed of light. And then it radiates back in on the threads of energy with the echo of the Big Bang, cosmic microwave background radiation to create the cinematic hologram of 3-dimensional space. But again, regarding free will, if the past, present, and future are out there, and it's like a movie. An actor in a movie might have free will, how to say the lines or what have you, but once the film is made, there's no freedom. That film's going to unfold the way it did. You know what? Finally, let me bring up this last point just for food for thought here. According to string theory, there are many universes. So how can you have free will and determinism? I'm going to, haven't even read from these other guys, but I just want to give a kind of a general cosmological context. According to string theory, even according to quantum mechanics, Hugh Everett III, back in 1957, I believe, he said, okay, wave of probability, you observe it collapses into a single point. What happens to all the points in which it didn't collapse? Aren't those potential particles equally real in a potential state? And he says, maybe they do collapse, but in a parallel universe, the only difference between which is the position of that one subatomic particle. So the string theorists, Leonard Susskind says, the string theory version of a multiverse is the same as Hugh Everett III's quantum mechanical version of a multiverse. The bottom line is every conceivable combination of atoms does exist in this universe or another. The difference between one universe and the one directly emerging from it is the position of one particle. It's almost indistinguishable. As that expands outward, the little tiny minuscule differences become enormous. Leonard Susskind asked, what would have happened if the Nazis won World War II? So in some universe that happened, he's saying. In some universe, this whole video, I'm saying everything the same, but one word was different. So every conceivable tiny little difference is happening in one universe or another. So regarding free will, that would say, even though this universe is fixed and predetermined at the horizon of the cosmos like a film, every action that I don't choose is chosen by some parallel version of me in another universe. And there's an infinite number of these parallel universes. And that's a question. Is it infinite? or is there just an enormously large number? That's a question that Susskind talks about, but let's assume there's an infinite number of parallel universes. You would have determinism and free will at the same time, it seems to me, because you have an infinite variety of choices to choose. There's no limit of what you could choose to do, and yet each of those choices is determined. So it's every choice you make is predetermined, but there's no limit to the choices you can make. So it seems you're getting the infinite extremes of freedom and determinism, and that union of opposites, that is what the psychologist Carl Jung defines as the self, the archetype of the self. So free will and determinism simultaneously to an infinite degree, that would satisfy the definition of Jung's idea of a self, which I've been equating with the gravitational singularity and the cosmic horizon. Okay, so that's a 16-minute cosmological preview. Let me get into Thomas Nagel. His article comes from What Does It All Mean? This was copyright 1987. And then, all right, so his example is choosing between cake and a peach. You should choose the peach, but you want the cake, you choose the cake. But you're saying, I could have chosen the peach. Could you? So there's his example. The determinists would say, no, you couldn't have. Even your own psychological predispositions are predetermined by sociological facts, biochemical facts. Everything is determined, and there is no free will. You have the illusion that you might have been able to choose the peach, but you didn't, and you never could have. All right, so page 173 on the left-hand column. Part of what it means may be this: nothing up to the point at which you choose determines irrevocably what your choice will be. This is what free will might mean. It remains an open possibility that you will choose a peach until the moment when you actually choose chocolate cake. It isn't determined in advance. Some things that happen are determined in advance, and he says the sunrise. I think that's, Hume would say, well, it most likely will rise, or at least the Earth most likely will continue to rotate on its axis, but we can imagine that not being the case. But at any rate, the mechanical things happen. They're forced to act according to the causal laws of mechanics. This is what the determinists are saying. Is there really such a thing as cause and effect? Hume says, nope, there's not. So that makes determinism hard to defend, because there's no chains of cause and effect. At any rate, on the right-hand column, 173, this is Nagel. He says, you couldn't have chosen it unless the possibility remained open until you closed it off by choosing cake. That's like quantum mechanics. There's a wave of probability. That particle could exist anywhere within that wave. So it could exist absolutely anywhere, but it could exist absolutely anywhere within the well-defined wave of probability, although that does stretch out to infinity at the edges. But when you observe that wave of probability, it collapses to a particular point. And that's kind of like there's innumerable possibilities for what I could do. Each of those possibilities, says Hugh Everett III's interpretation of quantum mechanics and Leonard Suskind's version of holographic string theory, is existing in a parallel universe. In one universe you chose the cake, in another you chose a peach, in another you picked up the cake, then put it down, and on second thought you picked up the peach. In the other universe, and there's an infinite variety of ways that transaction could have gone down. You could have paid for it with different denominations, a quarter and a nickel and a dollar or a $5 bill. That's what they're literally saying. That every single possibility remains open until you choose it, but some version of you will choose every conceivable possibility that was open to you. That's the megaverse theory, which is the standard belief among most of the academics today. Some say that, no, we can't empirically observe parallel universes, or for that matter, these little strings. So this isn't really part of physics. This isn't empirical science. But I think the majority of the physicists nowadays believe in the megaverse theory. All right, so continuing with Nagel, the right-hand column 173 says, the sum total of a person's experiences, this is determinism he's describing here, The sum total of a person's experiences, desires, and knowledge, his hereditary constitution, the social circumstances, and the nature of the choice facing him, together with other factors that we may not know about, all combine to make a particular action in the circumstances inevitable. So then he'll say, even if you can't predict exactly what's going to happen, that doesn't change determinism. The fact is that what all choices are determinable. They're determined because the laws of physics don't change. And so, it's a subtle point. So let me just read here. He says, this view is called determinism. The idea is not that we can know all the laws of the universe and use them to predict what will happen. First of all, we can't know all the complex circumstances. Secondly, even if we do learn something about the circumstances to try to make a prediction, that is itself a change in the circumstances, which may change the predicted result. That's reminiscent of quantum mechanics. When you observe that quantum wave of probability, you've altered it radically to determine where the particle is. You can know nothing now about its momentum. You can only know its position. If you want to know about its momentum, you can't know exactly where it is. You can only infer from its position how it had been moving in the past. All right, so continuing here, he says predictability isn't the point. The hypothesis is that there are laws of nature, like those that govern the movements of the planets, that govern everything in the world, and that in accordance with those laws, the circumstances before an action determines that it will happen and rule out any other possibility. All right, so that's determinism. A little lower down on the left-hand column on page 174, he says, however free you might feel when choosing between fruit or cake or between two candidates in an election, you would really be able to make only one choice. All right, so there's an important point. Democracy. People value democracy because you have the freedom to choose your leaders, or at least you have the freedom to choose from among a group of elected officials. So there's more choice than if it was just forced upon you by monarchical hereditary laws or something like that. But really, do you have the freedom to choose, or do the social forces and the genetic forces and the cosmic forces force you to make a choice that you're not really free? This is all predetermined, and human beings are just like the other mechanical things in the universe, obeying unavoidable laws of physics, and that the laws of psychology can be reduced to the laws of physics. That would be determinism. Of course, if that's true, then you can't blame anybody for anything. So what happens to the idea of moral responsibility? And then the determinists would say, you can still, first of all, you don't get to choose whether you will or not believe in determinism. And if it's determined that you're going to punish people for bad things, you're going to do it whether it's just or not. And even, you could say, we have to obey the laws of cause and effect, whether we want to or not. When someone does a crime, the laws of cause and effect say you must punish that person so as to prevent other people from emulating that action. And that's what causes other people to choose not to. But you didn't have a choice. You were predetermined to punish the criminal, and that causes other criminals to be more reluctant to commit crimes. But still, everything is determined. Okay, so the page 175 on the left. But is even this enough for free will? Some things. All right, so this is quantum mechanics up on the left-hand column, 175. These are the problems we must face if determinism is true, but perhaps it isn't true. Many scientists now believe that it isn't true for the basic particles of matter, that in a given situation, there's more than one thing that an electron may do. All right, so an electron can do things spontaneously without any apparent mechanical cause. But is even this enough for free will? Is this all you mean when you say, I could have chosen fruit instead? That the choice wasn't determined in advance? No, you believe something more. You believe that you determined what you would be doing, what you would do by doing it. It wasn't determined in advance, but it didn't just happen either. You did it, and you could have done the opposite, but what does that mean? So it means that you had choices, and for some reason, if you wanted to, you could have chosen to do the other thing, But if it's totally spontaneous and there's no reason for you to choose one or the other and things just happen, that's not freedom either. That's just things happening randomly. So let me, on the right-hand column, 175. Up to now, it has seemed that determinism is the big threat to responsibility, but now it seems that even if our choices are not determined in advance, it is still hard to understand in what way we can do what we don't do. Either of two choices may be possible in advance, but unless I determine which of them occurs, it is no more my responsibility than if it was determined by causes beyond my control. And how can I determine it if nothing determines it? All right, so if things just happen without a cause, that's not free will either. To have free will, you have to be the one who causes it to happen. But can you really choose what to do, or are all of your so-called choices predetermined by the laws of physics, the laws of social evolution, as the determinists would say? And so some people, these compatibilists, would say everything is determined, but you're still free if the cause of your action is your own internal desire. Granted, you might not have been able to choose which desires to have, but still, you acted according to your desire. That's as good as you're going to get. That's freedom. So Nagel says on 176 on the left, I myself can't accept the solution. If I thought that everything I did was determined by my circumstances and my psychological condition, I would feel trapped. And if I thought the same about everybody else, I'd feel that they were like a lot of puppets. Plato in The Laws has the Athenian stranger say that that's his view. It seems to him as if we're all puppets, playthings for God, and that God's pulling our strings. So then, there's another question. If there's a God, and God is omniscient, God knows the past, the present, and the future, can you have free will? If God knows what you're going to do, it seems to be determined, and you couldn't choose any other way. Some people say, well, God didn't determine what you're going to do. God sees things as they really are, occurring simultaneously. And to see somebody do something isn't the same as to make them do it. God knows we're going to do something in the future. That's just how humans think. God sees us doing it as we do it. From our vantage point, it's in the future, but from God's vantage point, it's us choosing to do it. All points of space and time coexist. So I'll get back into some of that. But Nagel's saying, if our desires are predetermined and we have no free will to choose them, we're still just puppets. On the other hand, he says, I'm not sure I understand how responsibility for our choices makes sense if they are not determined. It's not clear what it means to say I determine the choice if nothing about me determines it. So perhaps the feeling that you could have chosen a peach instead of a piece of cake is a philosophical illusion and couldn't be right, whatever the case. All right, there's Nagel. He doesn't know. He thinks we have free will, but then he says, I don't really know how to prove it. So now, free will and determinism, W.T. Stace, page 176. He's a compatibilist. So the question was, which do you prefer? Question 8, part B, the determinists, the compatibilists, or Nishida? And I'll do Nishida in the next video. Here's a compatibilist. The determinists say there's no free will. Everything is determined. And the compatibilists say, yes, everything is determined, but there's still free will, because all you need to do is define free will as acting according to your own desires. Whether your desires are predetermined or not, yeah, they are predetermined. So what? From your inner subjective experience, you're doing what you want to do. That's freedom. And that's what Nagel just said. No, you're still just a puppet if that's the case. So page 177, left-hand column. The dispute is merely verbal and is due to nothing but a confusion about the meaning of words. And so here in italics, he says, determinism is inconsistent with free will. This is what he's rejecting. If a man's actions were wholly determined by chains of causes stretching back into the remote past so that they could be predicted beforehand by a mind which knew all the causes, that's what we saw Laplace say, it was assumed that they could not, in that case, be free. This implies that a certain definition of actions done from free will was assumed, namely that they are actions not wholly determined by causes or predictable beforehand. Let us shorten this by saying that free will was defined as meaning indeterminism. This is the incorrect definition which has led to the denial of free will. As soon as we see what the true definition is, we shall find that the question whether the world is deterministic, as Newtonian science implied, or in a measure indeterministic, as current physics teaches, is wholly irrelevant to the problem. All right, so there he brings up Newtonian science. Laplace said if an infinite intelligence knew the position and the momentum of all the particles now, that person could extrapolate to the infinite past, infinite future, and know where everything would be with perfect precision. So everything would be determined. Quantum mechanics says you can't know the position and momentum of a particle. The more you know about one, the less you know about the other. Position's particle, momentum is the wave of probability. And furthermore, quantum particles within an atom do things spontaneously with no apparent cause. So either way, W.T. Stace says it doesn't have any bearing on the issue of free will, if you define free will properly. He gives an example of a judge and a prisoner. Did you confess of your own free will? No, I was beaten by the police. Oh, okay. So most of us would say you didn't give that confession freely. They beat it, a false confession out of you to get you to, they knew you would want them to stop beating you, and so that you'd tell them anything and sign anything, and that's not free. But a philosopher, hypothetical situation, says no one's free. The philosopher says to the foreman of the jury, so it's quite irrelevant to the case. There's no such thing as free will. If he did it because he's admitting the truth, or if he did it because of the police were beating him, it doesn't matter, because there's no such thing as free will. So the foreman and the rest of the jury would rightly conclude that the philosopher must be making some mistake. What then is the difference between acts which are freely done and those which are not? The free acts are all caused by desires or motives, or by some sort of internal psychological states of the agent's mind. The unfree acts, on the other hand, are all caused by physical forces or physical conditions outside the agent. All right, so this is the compatibilists. Everything's determined, they admit that, but there's two types of systems in the universe: material systems and psychological systems. And those acts that you make due to some psychological forces in your own mind, that's free. If you're following your own psychological desires, which are predetermined, you're still free. But if physical forces, which are also predetermined, force you to do something, then you're not free. Nagel used the example, if someone pushed you into the cake, you didn't choose that cake, that was forced upon you. So, continuing with W.T. Stace, this is from, by the way, an excerpt from Religion and the Modern Mind, 1952. So here he says, we may therefore frame the following rough definition. In italics, he says, acts freely done are those whose immediate causes are psychological states in the agent. Acts not freely done are those whose immediate causes are states of affairs external to the agent. So if you do something caused by your own desires, you are free. Then he says, I admit that there's some borderline cases. For example, if someone puts a gun to your forehead and says, give me your money, did you give them the money freely? Well, you decided in your mind that I want to give this guy money. So yeah, the compatibilists would say you acted freely. The guy didn't put your hand in your pocket, force your fingers to clench around it. But then he says he admits that in the case under discussion, though no actual force was used, the gun at your forehead so nearly approximated to actual force that we tend to say the case was one of compulsion. It's a borderline case. So a little lower on page 178, the right-hand column, the answer is that it is perfectly true that you could have told the truth if you wanted to. In fact, you would have done so, for in that case, the causes producing your action, namely your desires, would have been different and would therefore have produced different effects. It is a delusion that predictability and free will are incompatible. This agrees with common sense, for in knowing your character, I predict that you will act honorably. No one would say, when you do act honorably, that this shows you did not do so of your own free will. All right, that, to me, seems to be a weak argument. You can predict, in a general sense, the way people will behave in a very general way, but you can't predict the exact, precise movements of every facial muscle and the exact word and intonation that they use. So that seemed just to be a little bit weak. But even if you could, he's saying you'd still be free if what caused you to act is your own desire, even though those desires are all predictable and predetermined. That's compatibilism. So for that part B, question 8 question, determinism, nothing's free, everything's fixed, you have no choice, it's just an illusion. Compatibilism, the fact that you're forced by your own internal desires to act means you're free, because your desires, following your own desires is freedom. So true free will, people would say, no, you're not forced to act. Your desires are not forced upon you. You can choose from a variety of things to do. Could you prove that? So that's an open question. But moving on now to Stephen Cahn himself, the editor of our textbook. This is from Puzzles and Perplexities, Collected Essays, 2nd edition, 2007. And he begins with a famous legal case that I remember because it involves the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, whose books I've read. So I'll just read this here. 179, left-hand column. This is his case study for the examination of the issue of free will. So he says, in 1924, the American people were horrified by a senseless crime of extraordinary brutality. The defendants were 18-year-old Nathan Leopold and 17-year-old Richard Loeb, the sons of Chicago millionaires and brilliant students who had led seemingly idyllic lives. Leopold was the youngest graduate in the history of the University of Chicago, and Loeb the youngest graduate in the history of the University of Michigan. Suddenly, they were accused of the kidnapping and vicious murder of 14-year-old Bobby Franks, a cousin of Loeb's. Before the trial even began, Leopold and Loeb both confessed, and from across the country came an outcry for their execution. The lawyer who agreed to defend them was Clarence Darrow, the outstanding defense attorney of his time. And what Darrow argued was that both of these boys had been raised in such extremely bizarre circumstances for which they were not responsible, that their sick behavior was not their fault. They had no free will. And in fact, he says, none of us do. We're all helpless. So I'll just read a little bit more. 179, left-hand column. Darrow's defense was a landmark in the history of criminal law. He argued that the actions of his clients were a direct and necessary result of hereditary and environmental forces beyond their control. Leopold suffered from a glandular disease that left him depressed and moody. Originally shy with girls, he had been sent to an all-girls school as a cure, but had sustained deep psychic scars from which he never recovered. In addition, his parents instilled in him the belief that his wealth absolved him of any responsibility towards others. Pathologically inferior because of his diminutive size, and pathologically superior because of his wealth, he became an acute schizophrenic. Loeb suffered from a nervous disorder that caused fainting spells. His unhappy childhood, he wanted to commit suicide, he had a domineering governess, he had to cheat and lie to deceive her. His wealth made him think that he was superior to everybody. He became fascinated with crime, and by the time he reached college, he was severely psychotic. Okay, so they both became fascinated with Friedrich Nietzsche. They thought they were the Übermensch, the overman that Nietzsche talks about in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. They said, hey, look, we're the youngest graduates from these prestigious universities. We're wealthy, we're so intelligent, and plus they had these inferiority complexes for which they're trying to compensate. It's a perfect storm for doing some sick and twisted thing. We're above the law. We create the law. We'll prove we're above the law by killing this boy. One of theirs, what is it? Somebody's cousin. One of the two. It reminds me of Dostoevsky and Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment. Similar delusions. To prove, he wrote a paper that to prove he was above the law, you could kill somebody, and that would prove that you really didn't have these residual moral restraints which were foisted on you by a lesser type of people. That the Übermensch creates what is right and wrong, and there are no external moral absolute standards. All right, so that's what they were rebelling against. To prove themselves they were above the law, they murdered one of the two's cousins, and their lawyer said, look, they're nuts. They were forced by genetic problems. They didn't discover the gene until 1953, I believe, but at any rate, hereditary issues, socioeconomic issues. Darrow said, what had this boy to do with it all? He was not his own father or his mother or his grandparents. All of this was handed to him. He did not surround himself with governesses and wealth. He did not make himself, and yet he is to be compelled to pay. Darrow's plea was successful, for Leopold and Loeb escaped execution or were sentenced to life imprisonment. All right, but if they weren't responsible, none of us is responsible. We're all forced to act by our hereditary and socioeconomic circumstances, it would seem. As Darrow himself put it, we are all helpless, but is Darrow's argument sound? Does the conclusion follow from the premises, and are the premises true? We can formalize his argument as follows. So here's the argument, which he'll then go on to analyze in the rest of the article. He says, no action is free if it must occur. Premise 1. Premise 2. In the case of every event that occurs, antecedent conditions, known or unknown, ensure the event's occurrence. Everything has a cause. Conclusion, therefore, no action is free. That's determinism. So premise 2 is the thesis known as determinism. Put graphically, it is the claim that if at any time a being knew the position of every particle in the universe and all the forces acting on each particle, then that being could predict with certainty every future event. Again, we see the reference to Pierre-Simon Laplace from 1814. I might as well read it again since each of these guys has mentioned it. So in 1814, he said this, for it, this cosmic intelligence who knows the position and momentum of every particle at one given time and can extrapolate the past and future, for it, nothing would be uncertain, and the future as the past would be present to its eyes. Okay, so they keep talking about that. All right, so continuing here on page 180, left-hand column, what Darrow's argument purports to prove is that not a single human action that has ever been performed has been performed freely. And then he differentiates between hard determinism and soft determinism. Hard determinism says everything has a cause. Even our desires and our beliefs are forced upon us by these causes, so nothing's free. Soft determinism says, so what? Yeah, everything has a cause, but if you want to do something, that's free will. So what if the thing if your wants, if your desires are forced upon you, so what? What do we experience as free will? Doing what we want to do. And that experience is still there. So there is free will. But let me just read. So right-hand column 180. The determinist argues that your desire for such information, so why do we raise our hand to ask a question? The determinist argues that your desire for such information, together with your belief that the information is found in this book, cause you to read. All right, just as physical forces cause rocks and birds to do things, so human actions are caused by desires and beliefs. But your desires and beliefs are also determined. 180, left-hand column, granted, people's behavior cannot be predicted with certainty, but the hard determinist reminds us that each individual is influenced by a unique combination of hereditary and environmental factors. So even though you can't predict it, it is predetermined. Bottom of the left-hand column, 181. At this point in the argument, an anti-determinist is apt to call attention to recent developments in physics that have been interpreted by some thinkers as a refutation of determinism. They claim that work in quantum mechanics demonstrates that certain subatomic events are uncaused and inherently unpredictable. So he points out the same thing that Nagel points out. So if things just happen spontaneously, that's what causes free will. And the response is that if nobody caused it, still you didn't cause it, and therefore it's not free. Things can happen. Things that are forced to happen in a deterministic causal way obviates free will. And if things just happen spontaneously, again, there's no room for free will. So the right-hand column, page 181, the hard determinist's argument may appear plausible, yet few of us are inclined to accept its shocking conclusion. There's no moral responsibility, even though the hard determinists would still say, punishments will still go on because they cause the laws to be obeyed. Causality exists, but free will does not. The two are mutually exclusive, they say. So we opt, therefore, to deny one of its two premises. So the two premises, remember, these are the two premises of hard determinism on page 179. And it's no action is free if it must occur, if its causes are fixed. Premise 2, in the case of every event that occurs, antecedent conditions, known or unknown, ensure the event's occurrence. So things that happen before force the things that happen after. So you have to, if you want to maintain that the conclusion is therefore no action is free, if you want to say that some actions are free, you have to deny either premise 1 or premise 2. So we opt, therefore, to deny one of its two premises. Soft determinists, determinism is the view that the conclusion is false because premise 1 is false. All right, premise 1 says no action is free if it must occur. Soft determinists say, no, you must desire the things that you desire. Your psychological life is just as determined as your physical life, but that doesn't matter, because if you define free will as doing what you want to do, then whether your desires to do something are determined or not, you're still free. In other words, a soft determinist believes both that determinism is true and that human beings have free will. The implication of this position is that an action may be free even if it is part of a causal chain extending back to events outside the agent's control. So David Hume and John Stuart Mill defended this position, says Stephen Cahn. But David Hume also said there is no such thing as causality. So there could be no such thing as determinism. Things are not caused to happen because the very idea of causality is a human invention, an imaginary relationship between ideas that we insert. We see an event A happen, we see an event B happen repeatedly in that order. We assume there's some causal link between the two, but you can't see, smell, touch, taste, or hear it. So it must not really be factually a matter of fact. It's just a relation of ideas. All right, so over on the bottom of, actually, right-hand column, page 182, how do soft determinists define a free action? According to them, actions are free if the person who performs them wish to do so, and could, if they wish, not perform them. All right, so his term soft determinists is the same as compatibilist. For the question 8, part B, exam 3, determinism, incompatibilism. Determinism is what Cahn is calling hard determinism. Compatibilism is what he's calling soft determinism. Yes, my desires are determined, but so what? I'm doing what I desire, therefore I'm free. So continuing right-hand column, page 182, soft determinists emphasize that once we define freedom correctly, any apparent incompatibility between freedom and determinism disappears. A little lower, by this line of reasoning, soft determinists affirm both free will and determinism, finding no incompatibility between them. Okay, again, I say that you can combine determinism and free will and a genuine free choice if you take into account the idea of an infinite multiverse. I've mentioned that before. Every event, so you mentioned quantum mechanics there at the bottom of page 181 on the left-hand column. So sometimes I feel, is it really pertinent for me to keep bringing in quantum mechanics and string? It is, because these articles keep bringing up these issues, but they don't give much of an explanation. But according to quantum mechanics, there's a wave of probability until you observe it. It could appear anywhere within that wave, most likely at the peak or in the valley. Hugh Everett III said, well, where do all the particles into which the wave does not collapse exist after the wave does collapse? Maybe they all exist in a parallel universe. So if there's an infinite number of parallel universes, and every single choice you possibly could make is made by some version of you in one or the other, that implies that although every choice you could possibly make is determined and therefore there's no free will, there's an infinite number of choices you could make. There's no limit to the predetermined futures you can make. So I'm going to read, so I wrote about this, and I had it in a maxim here. So here's how I could summarize that. This union of determinism and indeterminism, or determinism and free will. So at each moment, we are forced by the flow of fate to choose freely from an infinity of fixed futures frozen in time by the infinite temperature at the horizon of each alternative universe. So space-time freezes at the horizon of the cosmos, where space-time is expanding at the speed of light, that causes it to have an infinite temperature from our perspective on Earth, not if you were there. If you were there, you'd be the center of the universe. We'd be at the infinitely hot horizon. I'm getting this from Leonard Susskind. But the point is that we have this union of opposites, determinism and free will, from that perspective. But then you could ask, well, am I the same person as the version of me in the parallel universe? Maybe I'm none of them. If I'm a soul, I'm none of these bodies. So those bodies are acting according to the laws of nature, but I'm just a soul, and there's a soul in me. When this body branches off into a parallel universe, there's another soul in that body that's not me. So many questions are raised by these, as I said in the beginning. I'm going to continue here. On page 183, Cahn brings up the essential issue against soft determinism or compatibilism on page 183, right hand. He says, but could my desires have been different? That is the crucial question. If my desires could not have been different, then I could not have acted in any way other than I did, which is the description of a person who is not free. So then on page 184, left-hand column, he says, remember that the hard determinist argues that because premises 1 and 2 of Darrow's argument are true, so is the conclusion. Soft determinists argue that premise 1 is false, that there are no, so let me just read this again, page 179. Here's the two premises of the lawyer Darrow's argument. No action is free if it must occur, premise 1. Premise 2 is that every action must occur because it has antecedent causes, a chain of cause and effect. So the soft determinists argue that premise 1 is false. No action is free if it must occur. The soft determinist says, yes, our desires must be what they are, but since we do what we desire, we're free. If they're mistaken, then the only way to avoid hard determinism is to reject premise 2. The position is known as libertarianism. So that means not every event has a previous cause. Some things are uncaused. So in a sense, he seems to me to be he'll go on to say libertarians think some things happen without a cause, but that brings up the issue, well, if you didn't cause them, it's still not free. It just happened randomly. You're just as much not responsible for a random act as you are for one that was forced upon you by outside forces. But then he'll bring up the idea about libertarians, say you act according to your own purposes, which brings up the idea of final causation, and I'll talk about Aristotle's idea of different types of causality. But let me continue on page 184, right-hand column. This is where the example is raising your arm to ask a question. The choice is yours. Nothing forces you to ask a question, and nothing prevents you from asking one. So they're saying things just happen, but does that mean things just happen spontaneously? It's not, there's no psychological history forcing you. The determinists would say, yeah, there's all kinds of minor motivations that are competing, and all of them are determined for why you chose to ask a question in class. And the libertarians would say, no, some things I decided I wanted to ask a question for no apparent reason. So the left-hand column, page 185, she acted as she did because her strongest motive prevailed. This is what the determinists say. Which motive was the strongest, however, was not within her control, and thus she was not free. The hard determinist's reply may seem persuasive. How can I deny that I am invariably caused to act by my strongest motive? Analysis reveals, however, that the thesis is tautological, immune from refutation, and so devoid of empirical content. So the determinists say even your desires are forced upon you and predetermined, and your strongest desire wins over. Whichever one has the most libidinous power behind it will force your action instinctively. But what Stephen Cahn is saying is, how can you define your strongest motive? He's saying there's a circular argument going on here. He says, if this line of argument appears powerful, the illusion will last only so long as we do not ask how we are to identify a person's strongest motive. The only possible answer appears to be that the strongest motive is the motive that prevails, the motive that causes the person to act. If the strongest motive is the motive causing the person to act, what force is there in the claim that the motive causing a person to act is causing the person to act. A circular argument. What caused you to act? You know, the strongest force. Well, which is that one? It's the one that caused me to act. So the strongest force and just the force that caused me to act, you're defining it. It's just a synonym for the same word here. No insight into the complexities of human action is obtained by trumpeting such an empty redundancy. A little lower, left-hand column, 185. However, both hard and soft determinists have another argument to offer against the libertarian's position. If the libertarian is correct, the free actions are uncaused, and they are uncaused. Why do they occur? Are they inexplicable occurrences? If so, to act freely would be to act in a random, chaotic, unintelligible fashion. So there's again, that's not freedom. So determinists argue that libertarians are caught in a dilemma. If we are caused to do whatever we do, libertarians assert we are not morally responsible for our actions. Yet, if our actions are uncaused and inexplicable, libertarians again must deny our moral responsibility. How then can libertarians claim we ever act responsibly? If we go over on page 186, the left-hand column, if we speak of a rock's purpose in falling off a cliff or a river's purpose in flowing south, we do so only metaphorically, for we believe that rocks and rivers have no purposes of their own. But libertarians are speaking not metaphorically, but literally when they say that people act in order to achieve their purposes. After all, not even the most complex machine can act as a person does. A machine can break down and fail to operate, but only a human being can protest and stop work on purpose. Is the libertarian's view correct? All right, so when I mentioned earlier that he says the libertarians seem to be arguing for indeterminacy, nothing determines our actions, they just happen. But then later he says, no, they're acting to achieve a purpose. So that would be what Aristotle called formal causality. So here's a book I taught at another community college in Northern Virginia, Community College in Nova. From Socrates to Sartre. It's a French name, it's a subtle pronunciation there. The Philosophical Quest by T.Z. Levine. He's talking about the four types of causality from Aristotle. There's the material cause, and his example is a house, building a house. So the material cause, the material of which the house is built. 2, the formal cause, the house to be built, the form to be actualized. That would be like the blueprint. 3, the efficient cause, the work and tools which produce the house as their effect. And finally, 4, the final cause, the purpose for which the house is built. Many contemporary scholars see in Aristotle's 4 causes only 2 distinct types of causes: matter, the material cause, and form, the formal cause. So Leibniz, he says, humans act according to a formal cause, a desire to achieve a purpose, and that material things act according to a material cause. Mechanical laws, pushing that things occurred in the past, pushed the things in the present to do what they want to do. Whereas souls, for Leibniz, monads, they're not pushed by antecedent events in a chain of causes and effects. They're pulled toward a thing they desire. Some archetypal idea draws them forward into the future. Material things are forced to do things from the past. Spiritual things are pulled to do things in the future. I'll just read this. This is from Monadology, aphorism number 79 and 80. Souls act according to the laws of final causes through appetitions, ends, and means. Bodies act according to the laws of efficient causes or motions. And the 2 realms, that of efficient causes and that of final causes, are in harmony with one another. God, the ultimate monad, harmonizes the 2 types of causes. I'm not going to read section 80. Okay, so at any rate, what the libertarians seem to be saying is that humans are following final causes or formal, the idea of a thing. They're drawn to achieve some goal in the future, and that's freedom, because their desire is caused by their own striving for the future, although he doesn't spell it out very clearly, in my opinion. But on 186, the left-hand column, he says, is the libertarian's view correct? I doubt anyone is justified in answering that question with certainty. But if the libertarian is right, human beings are often morally responsible for their actions. They deserve praise when acting admirably and blame when acting reprehensibly. Darrow may have been correct in arguing that Leopold and Loeb were not free agents, but if the libertarian is right, the burden of proof lay with Darrow, for he had to demonstrate that these boys were in that respect unlike the rest of us. Okay, so even if a person has no free will, he says, you'd still have courts of law, not because you thought the people were morally responsible, but they're sick, they have a mental illness, and you need to protect. So to Darrow, Leopold, and Loeb were sick men who needed the same care as a sick person with a contagious disease. After all, in a world without freedom, events need not be viewed as agreeable. They should, however, be understood as necessary. All right, so we went over those 3 articles, which will help give you material for Part A, Question 4, and Part B, Question 8, which also requires you to comment on Kitaro Nishida, who we will discuss in the next video.